This is National Educational Television, a program distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center.
Whoops, I just finished it on time. I think it's Webster's dictionary, or almost anybody's dictionary, defines friction as a rubbing, especially of one object against another. Now, we hardly need a dictionary to tell us that friction begets heat, and that heat sometimes reaches an intensity at which fire breaks out. Now, friction is going to be the topic of the theme of this discussion. The end product of friction between nations is regularly conflict. Now, sometimes that conflict is limited to conflict of a diplomatic character. Unfortunately, more often, this conflict becomes one of arms, and war breaks out. Now, as time went on in North America, each of the colonial powers began to expand. That we saw in our last discussion. And as they expanded, they came closer and closer to one another. Now, again, as time went on, each of the colonial powers, as it became better acquainted with North America, decided that it should have the continent for itself, that all these other people were intruders. Now, frictions developed, and frictions led to war. Oh, it was a century or so ago that the great historian of the 18th century, of 18th century history of North America, namely Francis Parkman, wrote a book which he called The Half Century of Conflict. Now, actually, he probably proved what is fairly true. Historians are not great mathematicians. Had he added up a little bit more carefully, he would have entitled his book 3/4 of a Century of Conflict, because it really breaks out at the end of the 1680s and runs into the middle of the 1760s. Now, as the Spaniards say, poco más o menos, that is 75 years. Let's follow it. You know, if we were, this is a temptation that I can't resist. If we were opening this with a commercial, I think the commercial would probably run something like this. Ladies and gentlemen, history brings you another thrilling tale. The contest for North America. Now, starring in the current cast is Johnny Bull and Mademoiselle La Belle France. And also to be seen is La Señorita España. So, here it is, the history show, and off we go. Well, let's go off first to Europe. Now, we're going to have to do this rather rapidly, and it'll be somewhat unsatisfactory, but nevertheless, the European background is so important in this whole setup that we can hardly understand what happens in the Americas without just a word or two. We're in the latter part of the 17th century. Now, for several decades, France has been ruling the roost in Europe. Her very dynamic and extremely ambitious young monarch, oh, he isn't so young anymore, he's getting along, but Louis XIV has decided that he is going to dominate Europe. And little by little, he's fought several wars and has extended the boundaries of Europe. He's aiming, the boundaries of France. He's aiming to round France out first to her natural frontiers. Now, he's the guy who says what the natural frontiers are. And if anybody's in the way, let them get out. Now, he rouses a great deal of antagonism on the part of his neighbors and most nations in Europe, for that matter. And it's out of this attempt to stop Louis XIV in his aggression, that war, and serious war, develops. And these wars develop an American counterpart. For example, at the end of 1688, there's a change of management in England. The English Parliament has tired of the Stuarts and has gone over to Holland and invited William of Orange to come over to become King of England. Now, William of Holland has been one of the great opponents of Louis XIV, and everybody recognizes that the French monarch is not likely to take this sitting down. And very soon, Louis issues a challenge, and out of that challenge grows the War of the English Succession, which runs from 89 down to 97. Then Louis has been checkmated at this point, but he is not beaten by any manner of means. His next move is to resort to diplomacy. He looks down across the Pyrenees and he sees the hapless and practically witless, he was, I believe you could say he was one shade below a half-wit, Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles II of Spain was dying, and there was no no direct heir to succeed him, and Louis XIV says, I've got a couple grandsons who are kind of on the unemployed list. Maybe I can slip one of them in. And so, through diplomacy, he brings it about that when they open up Charles II's will, he names Louis XIV's grandson, Philip of Anjou, as his successor. Woof! All the other nations figured that they had outmaneuvered Louis, and they find themselves in a tough spot. And so they decide to challenge this succession of a Bourbon to the Spanish throne. And from 1702 to 1713, there occurs in Europe what is known as the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, interestingly enough, both of these two wars start the fight in the Americas. For example, the War of the English Succession in the Americas becomes known as King William's War, and the War of the Spanish Succession becomes known as Queen Anne's War. Let's shift to the American scene and get over here toward our map. Now, in this first of the colonial wars, King William's War, France and England are at loggerheads. And the war, in general, is fought in 3 theaters. These are going to be pretty traditional. A few more will be added as time goes on. Here in this area, which we'll sketch rather roughly, and call it the New England-New York border. The French from the St. Lawrence Valley move in against New England, move in against the English in New York. Then there is an area of conflict out here for control of the fishing area. Newfoundland, the Acadian Peninsula, and the like. There's another area of conflict in the Hudson's Bay region. The French figured that this fur area was their private preserve. Now, as we mentioned in the last, 2 Frenchmen who had discovered the riches of the Hudson Bay region had transferred their allegiance to England, and England had taken advantage of the situation by establishing the Hudson's Bay Company. And they began to trade there. The French resented their trade, and when war broke out, they decided to, trade shots. Now, a traditional area of conflict is going to be down in the Caribbean. Let's just take that for granted. Any time that these two people go to war, figure that there's going to be trouble down here in the Caribbean area. See, remember that the Lesser Antilles go off this map. The map doesn't quite take them on, but they swing around in sort of a crescent-shaped form toward the coast of South America. Now, you might say, why worry about all these little island dots? Well, the answer to that is that they are terrifically important. These are sugar producers, and sugar is a product, is a commodity, for which there, in all these countries, there's terrific domestic demand, and for which there is a terrific potential market. So they would like, both England and France would like to have as much sugar-producing territory as they can. Now, in general, not too much comes out of the fight, except, it's kind of like the first round. They feint at one another, and maybe they indicate what their strategy is going to be. At least in this region, a number of the serious points of friction have been indicated. Now, when the negotiators get to the point of, after the war is finished in England, after this comes to an end with the Treaty of Ryswick, they sit down and plan for Europe. And they think nothing at all about the Americas. But just simply saying that American affairs are not important do not solve American problems, as becomes very, very evident as soon as the two great adversaries go back to war in the War of the Spanish Succession in the early years of the century. In the Americas, Queen Anne's War is its counterpart, is its colonial counterpart. Now, this is important from various points of view. And also, there are one or two new areas added. There's a new theater of war added down here in the Florida-Georgia region. Spain now is in the fracas, fighting on the side of France, so therefore her territory is, well, there's open season on it as far as the English are concerned. Now, this Queen Anne's War, in general, goes in favor of the British, and it ends with the Treaty of Utrecht. Let me put that down. I think, you know how to spell it, but let's just refresh your memories. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, a very important stepping stone, what do you want to call it, stage in colonial development. England obtains the lion's share of the spoils. The French have to admit that the English can control and trade in this area. The English win uncontested right to Newfoundland, and they win the Acadian Peninsula. They're not going to do anything about it for some time, but it is theirs. They, from Spain, they win some very important concessions. Well, one thing I was forgetting, as far as France is concerned, the Frenchmen now admit that the Iroquois are what we'll call English Indians, and that they are no longer going to try to meddle in in other words, keep the Iroquois stirred up, or try to stir them up against the English. So England feels fairly secure now up here on the New York-New England boundary. From Spain, she gets several very important concessions. Spain now recognizes her right to hold islands in the Caribbean, and also obtains the recognition of her capture, which had taken place about a half-century before, of Jamaica. Then the English are given the right to introduce Negro slaves into the Spanish colonies for a period of 30 years. Now, this gives them a foot in the door, something that John Hawkins, a century and a half previously, had tried to obtain. Now they have a foot in the door, and they also obtain some minor trading privileges, which they very quickly contrive to abuse. Now, after the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, there is a period of about a quarter century during which all groups recognizing that a showdown is going to come sooner or later, all groups try to strengthen their positions. For example, the French knock themselves out to strengthen their position down the middle of the continent. The English begin to push out toward the mountains. They put a buffer colony, the colony of Georgia here, to protect their Carolinas from possible attacks on the part of the Spaniards out of Florida. The English out of the Carolinas, the French from the lower valley, try to win the support of the Indians over here in this southeastern area of the United States. They're very particularly interested in winning, both sides are interested in winning the support of the Creek, who are quite strong and quite numerous. Now, the French, too, since they have been ousted from Acadia, move over to Cape Breton Island and found, or set up, their so-called great fortress, the Fortress of Louisbourg. And all along the line, everybody is intent on mending his fences against an evil day. Now, it's in the process of this that occasion comes for the next of the colonial wars, which, interestingly enough, this one starts in the Americas. And this is a war probably with one of the most fantastic names of any war, the War of Jenkins' Ear. And that's exactly what it was. That's what started the whole, the whole operation. Let me tell you about it. The English moved into the Caribbean and decided, since they were legitimate slave traders now, that maybe they could expand their contraband, their smuggling activity. Spain resented this and began to rebuild, to revitalize her Coast Guard, her Armada de Barlovento. And it was on one occasion when a Coast Guard cutter came upon a Spanish, an English merchantman, which obviously had no business being there, and hailed it too. The Spanish captain boarded the vessel and met the English captain, a chap by the name of Thomas Jenkins. There was quite a, seems to have been quite an exchange of unpleasantries between them, and the Spaniard, in a fit of pique, whips out his sword, clips off Jenkins's ear, picks it up and gives it to him, and he said, "Here, Butch, do whatever you want with this, but go back and tell your king that if I had him here, I'd take off both of his." Kind of gory, almost fits in the comics. Now, so Thomas Jenkins, he takes the ear, very gently, obviously, soaks it in brine, and wraps it up in a little box. He gets back to England and seeks out the leader of the opposition party. At this particular time, it was Walpole. Walpole, or I beg your pardon, Walpole was the prime minister. Pitt and his group were quite dissatisfied with Walpole. They said he's selling out English honor to these dastardly Spaniards simply to maintain the peace. So Jenkins comes to these boys and he said, "Look, here's what they're doing to self-respecting, law-abiding smugglers in Spanish waters." There it is. That's all they need. Spain and England are at war. Now, about the same time, there's trouble on the continent. There's been a change, or at least a succession, to the Austrian throne. Old Emperor Joseph has died, and he has no son to succeed him. And he's arranged with the powers to recognize his daughter Maria Theresa. Well, they all say, "Sure, we'll take good care of the little lassie." And as soon as the old emperor breathes his last, they begin to get together and they say, "Now, what Austrian territory do we want?" And Frederick the Great moves out and grabs Silesia. Well, soon Maria Theresa says, "Somebody must come to my assistance," and England is perfectly willing to come to her assistance. At this time, France ranges herself on the side of Prussia. Now, you've already got Spain and England fighting in the Caribbean. You've got France and England fighting on the continent of Europe. So therefore, the whole thing will develop into another one of the Continental Wars, King George's War. And this is pretty much along traditional lines. The French attack the New York, New England border. The English attack the Spaniards. They all go at one another down in the Caribbean, but nothing much comes out of it. The peace which is arranged in 1748, the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, is a very unsatisfactory peace, and everybody recognizes it's little more than a truce. So let's take a deep breath and get ready for a greater fight. Now, interesting, for this next war, they're going to add a new area of conflict. And it's at this area of conflict, strangely, far out in the American backwoods, that the whole thing gets underway. What we know as the French and Indian War, and it has, interesting at this point, it has a European complement, the 7 Years' War. Now out here in the American backwoods, at the present site of Pittsburgh, at the point at which the Allegheny River flowing down from the north joins with the Monongahela coming up from the south, and together they form this mighty stream, the Ohio, the beautiful Ohio, which is very beautiful from this point of view. It is the road of entry, nature's road of entry, avenue of approach into mid-continent. Now, whosoever controls the forks of the Ohio has the door open into the interior of the continent. Now remember the French plan. The French want to hold the interior of the continent so that they may contain the English. The English want to break that containment. The French move out first, and right after the peace, they send an expedition into the Ohio country, and there this man, Blainville, Saint Laurent de Blainville, reiterates the claims that France had had to the country for a number of years. He's very much worried, however, because he finds too many traces of English penetration, English trader penetration. So therefore, in the next years, France moves, and moves rather rapidly. She founds several forts. I've got Pittsburgh over here too far. Let's get Pittsburgh down in about here. And forget that this is, well, call this whatever you want. She founds several forts on a line moving toward the forks. Presqu'île, Le Boeuf, Venango. Then moves to put Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. Now, at this point, she runs into competition. As a matter of fact, there's practically a traffic jam at the forks of the Ohio. The Pennsylvania traders who had established themselves out here in the Ohio country and had been run out by the French, they figure the French at the forks, that's dangerous. Our trading enterprise with the Indians, well, it's just apt to blow up in our face. So they are in opposition, but then opposition comes from another quarter, comes from Virginia. Now, Virginia claimed, by right of an old charter, that the land out here in the West belonged to her. And around mid-century, a group of enterprising Virginians had founded a land company, and they were looking forward to the day when their surveyors could go out, lay out the plots, and then they could put them on the market. So therefore, you have the French interested, you have the Pennsylvania traders interested, you have the Virginia land speculators interested. Now, when the word gets in that the French have actually moved and are trying to put a fort, Duquesne, at the forks, the Virginians send out a young colonel of the militia, George Washington, to inform them that they are trespassing. There is a brush between the two groups, and, as you know, shots are fired. Washington has to capitulate, and the spark, or the spark has been struck. Now, the early stages of the war go in favor of the French, and particularly the Indian friends of the French. Connected with that, the most salient feature is Braddock's defeat. You know, Braddock, a veteran, comes over, and the colonial officers say, now look, General, you're used to fighting on the battlefields of Europe where things are done comme il faut, as they should be. We don't have those kind of rules. We don't slug it out by the Marquis of Queensberry rules over here. This is a different kind of fighting. And you can, I think, understand, though you can't condone Braddock's stupidity, these colonials don't know exactly what they're talking about. And so he has a road built so that he can march his red-coated boys out 4 and 6 abreast. Pot shots for the Indians, for the French, and woof. The whole thing looks like it's folding up. The French are successful along the lakes, taking several key points like Ticonderoga, Oswego, Crown Point, and the like. And it's not until 57 when William Pitt, who was really the founder, at least from the point of view of getting the concept, the founder of the British Empire, when he sees that winning the war in America, and there's another war going on between the French and the English in India, winning those two colonial wars is paramount for the English future. And he changes military leadership, and the rest of the story you know. Quebec is surprised and taken, even though both of the excellent generals involved, Montcalm for the French and Wolfe for the English, die as a result of wounds. Montreal is taken, and the French are pushed out of the continent. The war goes on in the Caribbean for some little time. Spain gets in just in time to lose Cuba, and so on. But England emerges triumphant. In 1763, the plenipotentiaries meet at Paris. And this marks the end of the French Empire in North America. France has to yield. She yields Canada. She yields the Trans-Allegheny West. She has previously turned over part of her valley claims to Spain. And the English are now the major contender for the prize of North America. The Spaniards are still in the picture. Now, the English strategy is this. We'll stop for a few moments, organize, and then we won't have much trouble running the Spaniards out. Now, there's trouble. There is trouble along the line. They never get the chance. Somebody else does it, but that's part of another story. The literature on this struggle for the continent is quite voluminous. A great deal of Francis Parkman's work runs along those lines. There are 3 little volumes of this Chronicles of Canada series by William Wood. They come in sequence: The Great Fortress, then The Passing of New France, which is the story of Montcalm, and the Winning of Canada, which is the story from the English side, all of these by William Wood. In the Chronicles of America series, you have an overall study by George McKinnon Wrong. Well, let's take this from the outside because it's easier to see. The Conquest of New France. Now, more recently, an American historian, Lawrence Gibson, has produced a series of volumes leading up to this. Several of them tell the whole story of this rivalry, and it's extremely interesting. We'll see.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.